Hi everyone. Today I'm really excited to talk to y'all about diet culture and how we can find a bit more peace with food, movement, and our bodies. So, going into a topic outline, today I'm going to talk about a little bit of the history of diet culture, what diet culture looks like today, why diets don't really work, and what an alternative to dieting might be. This will be intuitive eating and movement. And then I'll answer a few frequently asked questions. So, what is diet culture? Diet culture is this system of beliefs that worships thinness and equates it to health and moral virtue. It promotes weight loss as a means of attaining higher status. It demonizes certain ways of eating while elevating others. And it really oppresses people who don't match up with its supposed picture of health, which disproportionately harms women, femmes, trans folks, people in larger bodies, people of color, and people with disabilities. And why I think this is really important to talk about right now is because we're in the midst of a pandemic. And diet culture tells us that during a global pandemic, we should be policing the size of our bodies instead of caring for our health. And during uncertain times and at all times, your priority is really to take care of yourself the best that you can. And some days this could be an online workout, other days this could be watching Netflix. And I'd also encourage you to be really curious about your cravings right now. Your body and brain need nourishment and peace, love, connection, comfort, and pleasure during stressful times. Also, diet culture is trying to make a connection between body size and increased COVID risk. And despite what you may have seen in the news or on social media, there actually is no evidence that being at a higher weight puts you at higher risk for contracting COVID 19. And so we need to stop reflexively blaming body fat and start looking at the real culprits, which are systemic injustice and discrimination against marginalized communities. So, diving into the history of diet culture, I want to start with classical antiquity. So, during this period, there was a lot of anxiety about what abundance meant. Moderation and balance in all things came to be seen as virtue, and any level of excess was a flaw. So, when it came to eating, overindulgence was deemed a moral failing, and food was to be consumed exclusively for fuel, not for pleasure, and fatness was viewed as a symbol of moral corruption. And the Latin word obesus, the root of the English obesity, was coined during this period and translates as having eaten until fat. Also, our word for diet comes from the ancient Greek dieta, a term that didn't enter widespread use until Hippocrates and his fellow physicians started using it in medical texts, primarily to refer to eating, drinking, and exercise habits, and occasionally also to bathing and sexual practices. And the way these ancient Greek doctors saw it, anyone who didn't follow those rules properly was intellectually and morally inferior. And so, from the beginning, the term diet was really bound up with ideas about morality, restriction, the renunciation of pleasure, and the superiority of certain races. And transitioning into modern colonialism, colonizers started to form ideas about race based on their contact with new people. So the Spaniards thought that their bodies looked different from the indigenous folks because they ate differently. And if they started eating the bad, quote unquote, local foods, their bodies would literally transform to look like the people that they were colonizing. And moving into the American Industrial Revolution, this is when textile production became increasingly mechanized, leading to standardized clothing sizes. And in the mid 1830s, this Presbyterian minister, Sylvester Graham, namesake of the cracker, began to advocate abstinence from all sorts of things like spices, meat, sugar, caffeine, alcohol, yeasted bread, believing that they all led not only to indigestion and illness, but also to sexual excess and civil unrest. So Graham and his followers began weighing themselves regularly to prove that this diet allowed them to maintain their weight, which is actually the first evidence of a group of Americans tracking their body weight. And then in the mid to late 1800s, a huge new wave of immigrants led the white middle class to look for ways to maintain their dominance. And I'll read this quote here by cultural historian Emily Contois. Part of the rise of a thinner ideal to define a middle class American citizen was this contradistinction to the stout, sturdy immigrants. So, in other words, the anxious middle class started thinking of thinness as a mark of social status. And going into a bit of the racist origins of fat phobia, the 19th century saw emerging theories about race and evolution that categorized people into a racial hierarchy based on which groups were supposedly more civilized or evolved. And of course, the scientists doing the categorizing were predominantly white men of Northern European descent, including most famously Charles Darwin. And as important as evolutionary theory was when it came to explaining how we all came to be on this planet, it was also used in overtly racist ways to justify the white Anglo-European male domination of other cultures and genders. So 19th century scientists decided that fatness was a marker of savagery because it appeared more frequently in the people of color that they observed. Also, women of all ethnicities were believed to be at greater risk of fatness, which was taken as further evidence of their supposed evolutionary inferiority. So these days, diet culture really pushes that narrative that the reason we stigmatize larger bodies is that higher weight causes poor health. However, fat bodies were deemed uncivilized and undesirable long before the medical community began to label them a health risk. Therefore, fat phobic beliefs predated health arguments. Now, talking a bit more about women and the thin ideal, in 1890, Charles Gibson created the Gibson Girl for Life magazine, a drawing of a young, white, well-to-do woman that you see on the right there. And this really started the practice of using these aspirational images of thin white women in advertising. After that came the flapper aesthetic, which was even more constricting. Flappers' clothes were all about straight, slim lines, and women had to bind their breasts and restrict their food intake to fit into them. The diet industry also began to bring new products to the market, such as scales and laxatives. And diet culture was also wrapped up in politics. The pressure on women to shrink themselves really distracted them from growing their political power. And the anti-suffrage movement portrayed suffragists as fat, masculine, and angry, with the aim of dissuading women from joining the movement. So, how did science and medicine jump on this diet culture train? Doctors were influenced by life and health insurance companies who, around the turn of the 20th century, started using a measure called the Quetelet Index, later rebranded as the Body Mass Index. And this index was developed by a Belgian astronomer, Adolphe Quetelet, in the 1830s as a way to test whether the laws of probability could be applied to human beings at the population level. It was created as a statistical exercise, not a medical instrument, and was never intended for clinical use. And also, of course, Quetelet also developed his equation using an exclusively white European population. So moving through history, in the 1920s, people took up methods such as smoking cigarettes and fasting to try to lose weight. The 30s brought diet pills, progressing to amphetamines, aka speed. Gyms and fitness became more popular. And in the 1950s, the market for bariatric surgery was born. And this is when the term morbid obesity was coined by bariatric surgeon Howard Payne. He wanted to frame bariatric surgery as a necessary and even life-saving intervention. And then from the 70s to the 90s came a proliferation of new nutrition trends and fad diets like Atkins and South Beach Diet, etc. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the making of the quote unquote obesity epidemic. So in 1998, millions of Americans became quote unquote overweight and obese overnight because the NIH released a report changing its BMI thresholds for what it considered overweight and obese. And they established these new cutoffs based on a World Health Organization report, which in turn was primarily written by another organization that was funded by weight loss pharmaceutical companies. So by adding nearly 40 million people to the numbers supposedly at risk because of their weight, the NIH elevated obesity to a level of public health importance, and funding for quote unquote obesity research jumped from about 50 million in 93 to more than 400 million by 2004. And today, it's really the prevailing view that obesity is one of the biggest, baddest killers around. Yet our quick trip through history shows us that it's very much a system of oppression with its roots in racist, sexist beliefs about food and bodies. And I'd also like to note that framing obesity as a public health crisis also has the unintended consequence of creating and exacerbating a stigma against people in larger bodies. And that stigma in and of itself is harmful to people's health. There's scientific evidence that shows weight stigma is an independent risk factor for an array of negative physical health outcomes, such as diabetes and heart disease, regardless of people's actual body size. And so, what does diet culture look like today? In the early 2000s, clean eating became one of the most popular manifestations of modern diet culture. And this is a fixation on dietary purity and categorizing food in terms of virtue and vice, such as clean versus dirty, whole versus processed, etc. And this creates an imagined moral hierarchy in which people who eat clean are viewed or view themselves as morally superior to those who don't. And in that sense, clean eating has echoes of religious dietary laws. Many people in this day and age kind of treat diets like religions, even in the secular world. And diets do provide a system of beliefs to organize behavior, a way of identifying yourself, and a community of others who share those beliefs. But the problem in the case of clean eating is the belief system often takes over your life, and it prevents you from developing your own identity and values outside of food and eating. Clean eating can also often lead to orthorexia nervosa, an eating disorder defined as an obsession with correct, quote unquote, eating. And I took this a little screen grab recording on my own Instagram. I searched hashtag clean eating just to show what we find. And there was a 2017 study that showed that higher Instagram use was associated with a greater likelihood of having orthorexia. Now, modern day diets have one thing in common. They claim not to be diets. They say they're about health and wellness and not dieting, and this is just a rebranding. Most diets today opt for terms such as protocol, reset, reboot, cleanse, detox, lifestyle change. And also the new wellness diet is not just about weight, but thinness, youth, physical ability, wealth, and whiteness. And the way diet culture conceives of health is really bound up in healthism. And this is a belief that health is a moral obligation and that people who are healthy deserve more respect and resources than people who are unhealthy. And healthism further makes health out to be exclusively a matter of individual responsibility rather than a matter to be addressed at societal and policy levels. So why don't diets work? Research indicates that our bodies have a weight, you've probably heard of a weight set point, but actually they have a weight set range that they're genetically programmed to maintain. And when you repeatedly try to force your body below its set range, it may eventually increase that range to protect you against future famines, aka diets. So to your body, diets or lifestyle changes feel like famine. Even the most seemingly gentle diet pulls this pendulum to the side of restriction. And your body's natural response is to push that pendulum back to the other side, to eating a lot, feeling out of control with food, or binging. And this is not a failure of your mind to control your body. This is your body taking care of you. I'd also like to note dieters' risk of developing an eating disorder can be 18 times higher than non-dieters. And talking about a vicious cycle, for the majority of folks, intentional weight loss is only going to result in weight cycling. And this is very stressful for the body. Weight cycling leads to fluctuations in blood pressure, heart rate, nervous system activity, kidney filtration rate, blood sugar, blood lipids, all known cardiovascular risk factors. And also mentioning emotional eating, what people often label as emotional eating is just a completely understandable response to deprivation. So people who identify as emotional eaters don't need to learn how to cope with their feelings without using food. They just need to learn how to cope with their eating without using diets. So what can we do instead of diets? This is where intuitive eating comes in. So intuitive eating is the body's default mode. When we were babies, we made noise when we were hungry. We didn't feel the tiniest bit of shame about it. We demanded our needs be met, and we owned our hunger. And once we were full and satisfied, we lost interest in food and turned our attention to other things, like moving our bodies when we felt like it and resting when we needed to. And as we grew up, diet culture really told us that our hunger is wrong and that we shouldn't own it or make noise about it. It demonizes fullness and tells us that our instincts are bad and wrong. And this causes us to lose our connection to our inner wisdom and start to feel like we can't be trusted around food. And further, when we aren't heeding our hunger signals, our bodies are actually programmed to start pumping out more and more of the hormones and neurotransmitters that drive us to eat. And that process virtually guarantees that we'll feel out of control with food. So what can we do? We really need to start learning how to recognize our hunger and trust that we're allowed to eat as much food as it takes to satisfy it. We need to feed ourselves at regular intervals and feed ourselves enough, even if our bodies aren't giving us clear hunger signals. So this means eating when you're not hungry because you're about to go into a long meeting with no food. It also means having some cake at your friend's birthday party because you like the taste and you want to celebrate. And it means honoring that little voice in your head saying, I need more, even when you think you should be full. Research has shown that intuitive eaters who don't have any off limits foods or follow any diet culture rules have better health outcomes, including lower cardiovascular risk, decreased triglyceride levels, lower levels of body dissatisfaction, and better self esteem. So I'd really encourage folks to focus on self-care rather than self-control. Diet culture is telling us to control our desires, to fight our body's natural cues, and it keeps us stuck in mere survival mode, obsessing over food and our bodies. Your body is not meant to be at a weight that it can sustain only through restriction. So we need to push aside that diet culture messaging and use tools of self-compassion rather than self-punishment to find peace with food and movement. Now, I want to address a few questions that I'm sure some of you are having. What about nutrition? So, the diet culture message about nutrition goes something like this: if you're allowed to eat whatever you want, you're going to eat nothing but quote unquote unhealthy foods. So, you need food rules. But actually, when people settle into trusting that they're allowed to eat whatever they wish, they typically find that they want a wide variety of foods. And I'd like to remind us that researchers have found that when it comes to the modifiable determinants of health, eating and physical activity combined account only for about 10% of population health outcomes. And also, ceasing to moralize about food helps shift the focus back to the determinants of health, which are social inequality, poverty, chronic stress, discrimination, that matter a lot more than how much kale you eat. Another question I'm sure some folks have: what about diabetes? Yes, someone with diabetes might have a blood sugar spike from eating a carbs only meal or snack, which is within their rights as an autonomous human being to do if that's what they want. But the likelihood of that spike significantly diminishes if the meal or snack also includes foods containing protein, fat, fiber, since all of those nutrients help slow the digestion of carbs and thereby stabilize blood sugar levels. So if you have diabetes, you can experiment with various food combinations and recipes, in addition to paying attention to your hunger cues, energy levels, and sense of satisfaction and pleasure in eating to figure out what keeps your blood sugar in a range that works for you, while also allowing you to enjoy life. So instead of demonizing carbs, as diet culture would have everyone with diabetes do, you can learn to work with these nutrients. And big end-all question, what about health? And I put this in quotes because usually it's a very narrow definition of health. And once again, health is not a moral obligation. You aren't required to pursue it in order to prove your worthiness. Plus, people aren't always able to pursue or prioritize their health because of circumstances such as poverty, food and job insecurity, caregiving duties, disabilities, or a host of other reasons. Further, health looks different for everyone, and numerous factors go into our overall health that have nothing to do with the size of our body, the food we eat, or the amount of exercise that we get. So how can we think of health differently? There is an approach called health at every size, or Haze, and this is a weight-inclusive, anti-diet approach to healthcare that's designed to help you take care of your body without trying to shrink it. And I'm just going to read off the principles of Haze. So it includes providing weight-inclusive care that accepts and respects body diversity, supporting health-related policies and practices that help people's well-being in a truly holistic sense, including their physical, emotional, social, spiritual, and economic needs, refusing to blame people for their health outcomes, working to end discrimination and stigma based on body size or any other form of identity, providing respectful care that acknowledges the intersecting identities people hold, among them race, gender, and socioeconomic status, promoting intuitive eating and a pleasurable relationship with food rather than external eating plans designed to shrink the body, supporting a joyful relationship with movement that allows people of all sizes, shapes, and abilities to determine their own level of engagement in physical activity. And talking a little bit more about physical activity, I'd encourage folks to start using the word movement in place of exercise. And the word exercise was originally used to describe both military drills and driving livestock to the field to plow. So it's no surprise that people view it in a sort of punishing way. And movement doesn't have to look a certain way, doesn't have to burn a certain number of calories, it doesn't have to be a certain number of steps every day. It can be structured or unstructured, and its purpose is not to shrink or reshape your body. Movement is intuitive, flexible, and unrelated to diet culture, whereas exercise involves a lot of control and guilt and shoulds. So, what are some guidelines for the workplace? When you're implementing a wellness program, try to avoid programs that focus on weight or weight loss. Providing nutritional recommendations, be sure that they're inclusive of all food groups and don't demonize types or quantities of food. And be on the lookout for messaging around your workplace, like signs promoting calorie counting. Also, be sensitive talking about personal diet plans, weight goals, or exercise regimens. Also, please refrain from commenting on someone's weight loss or gain. It tells the person you're complimenting that their body was bad or wrong before, and that it's worthy of acclaim only now that it's smaller. And it tells anyone listening the same thing. We need to remember that weight loss can stem from not only disordered behaviors, but from health issues, grief, food insecurity, or any number of other factors. And I'll leave us with this concept of diet culture as a life thief. So, living in line with your values, belonging to a community, having a meaningful way to contribute to the world, feeling safe and accepted, having your basic needs met, all of these things are essential ingredients for happiness. And diet culture robs people of these things. It takes us out of the moment, disconnects us from ourselves and others, threatens our sense of safety, and deprives us of our basic needs. And regarding our identity, by making us feel self conscious and not good enough in our own bodies, diet culture disconnects us from them and thereby makes us question our very identities and our basic worthiness as human beings. So I'll end with this quote here. Dieting keeps us too hungry, too fixated on our bodies, and too caught up in the minutia of our eating regimens to focus our energies on changing the world. And that's exactly the point of diet culture.